Did she manage to sell it? A Brexit breakthrough with Brussels seems like the easy part now. What with Theresa May facing the music in Parliament and then a divided cabinet, a meeting which was scheduled to last 3 hours and which has run well over. We're going to gauge reactions to the 500-page draft agreement, which, well, except for those ministers, no one else yet has seen. Also, what it would mean for the UK's future trade relations with the continent, its closest neighbour, Ireland. What happens next with both the left and the right in Britain split over the agreement? The hardest sell of all is convincing a divided electorate and a UK parliament where the fault lines don't necessarily run along party lines. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what is indeed a hard sell. Joining us from London, Graham Gooch, Research Associate at Cambridge University, former advisor to Northern Irish First Minister David Trimble. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The Guardian correspondent here in Paris, Kim Wilshire, is with us as well. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
And France 24 Europe editor, Catherine Nicholson, who's brought an impressive stack of papers here.
Lots of papers, which I'm probably not going to need.
Okay. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. The UK press had billed this as Judgment Day for Theresa May. And we're seeing from, as you can see from those headlines, the Judgment Day headline, by the way, from the Daily Mirror. Of course, it's not quite Judgment Day. Judgment Day will be when the UK Parliament votes, if it comes to a vote, because, again, that meeting has now run over. We've been hearing in the last hour there's going to be a short statement on the part of Theresa May, which will, of course, will carry for you live. And then she'll be briefing Parliament again on Thursday. Graham Gooch, should we be reading anything into the fact that it's going to extra time?
Yes, I think it indicates difficulties for Theresa May. I think if it had gone very smoothly, I think the meeting would have been the 2 or 3 hours that were budgeted for it. So probably indicating quite a bit of difficulty, but actually rather little surprise there.
Rather little surprise. What are the possible scenarios coming out of this meeting?
Well, couple of scenarios. I mean, Theresa May get away with no resignation and a degree of cabinet support. But the other scenario is that there will be several resignations. I mean, the current rumours are there may well be at least 2. Some of the key ministers look as if they're pretty unhappy, but they're going to hold on in there. So Theresa May be able to get through this meeting, but then she, as you were saying earlier, she then has to put this to Parliament and get that through. And it really looks as if she hasn't the numbers there. It's very hard to see how she can get this deal through Parliament.
Those resignations, at what point can she no longer just soldier on and have to throw in the towel and quit as Prime Minister if there's enough resignations?
I think if there are 2, let's say not frontline ministers resigning tonight, she can probably live with that. She can get away. If there were a couple of the really key ministers resigned, that would be a big problem for her. But I think many people are expecting that it's really, if this falls down in Parliament, that's really probably the end of Theresa May. There will probably be a leadership election in the Conservative Party at that point.
Kim Wilshire?
Well, yes. I mean, the point is, if 2 ministers resign, it's true. She can probably get away with that. The problem is, it's almost impossible to see how Theresa May can get this through Parliament. It's not satisfying Remainers. It's not satisfying Brexiters. It's not really, it seems, satisfying anybody. People are saying it is better than no deal. But that's as good. That's as good as the comments that we're hearing. It's better than nothing, which is undoubtedly true. But the numbers just don't add up for a parliamentary vote.
Let's talk about those numbers for a second. Your newspaper, The Guardian, saying there's a group of about 13 MPs who are Remainers who will not be voting for a deal in the end. Then there are also, but on the other hand, you have the hard Brexit backbenchers. You have people in the Labour Party who, according to the Times of London,
well,
there's some 30 of them who will be backing Theresa May on a Brexit vote. So,
well, it's a mess. It is a mess.
How do we do the math on this?
And I don't think anybody knows how the numbers will stack up. I don't think anyone really knows how it will happen. I mean, it's hard to see how Theresa May the Conservative government only has a majority thanks to the DUP. The DUP is not going to sign up to this.
That's 10 seats already.
That's 10 seats already. The people. There are people in her own party who will not vote for it, and these are people who are hard Brexiters. And people who support Remain. The Labour Party is divided as well. As I say, it's almost it's very hard to see how, even if there are if there's limited damage in terms of resignations, it's extremely hard to see how Theresa May can get this through Parliament.
How to see where she can get it through Parliament. Before we pick up on that point, we got to say that in a parallel universe, there are these EU ambassadors. Catherine Nicholson, your source is telling you that they've been sequestered in Brussels?
More or less, yes. What's been happening today in Brussels is we had a midday briefing, the regular midday briefing from Margarita Skinas, the spokesman, and he gave absolutely nothing away, really saying, the Commission is aware of what's going on in London and we're leaving it to them, really not wanting to put any outside influence on what's going on there. And at the exact same moment that the British Cabinet was called into Downing Street to see this deal, discuss it with Theresa May, that was when a meeting started with the ambassadors from the other 27 EU member states. As far as I'm aware, they are still in that room where they've been having their briefing in Brussels. I think their briefing is over. It's obviously more of a briefing rather than the debate that'll be going on behind that door there, number 10. Yes, in the interests of not influencing anything politically on the other side of the English Channel, those people not allowed to make any leaks and indeed, as I understand it, not allowed to leave the room and start tweeting or calling anybody.
It's less of a mess than what Kim Wilshire described, though, on their side.
Absolutely. I think you can say on the European side, people keep asking me, what about this country, that country that might be more likely to support the UK, or some countries that might want to sort of throw Ireland under the bus and say, we don't care that much about the backstop. Right up until this point, and including today, there has been complete and utter unity among the EU 27, as we know them. They have lined up behind Michel Barnier and said, this is the man who is negotiating on behalf of all of us for the Commission. Complete and utter unity, because let's not forget what's being negotiated at the moment is just the withdrawal agreement about how the UK leaves. All of the future deals, future relationship, that is yet to come. That can't be negotiated until after the UK has in fact left. So at this point, it's in the EU's interest, clearly, to sort of say, look, this is London's issue. The UK voted for this. We've got one negotiator on our side, and London, you deal with your own arguments among yourselves. That's been the position the whole way through, and it's still the position today.
Graham Goodgen, that question I put to you at the outset about the possible scenarios. Earlier, we asked one investment analyst in London, and he said, well, for him, undoubtedly, there's a worst-case scenario, which is no deal. My question to you is, yes, there's a lot of infighting. Yes, there's a lot of competing and varying points of view when it comes to Brexit. But at the end of the day, isn't the Conservative Party the party of business, and isn't it in their interest to come together and find a deal?
Yes, I think that's largely true. But we've got a conflict. There are several dimensions of conflict here, and one of them is really between the short term and the long term. Many of the Brexiteers believe that the long-term economic interests of the UK lie outside the European Union. That we should be orienting our trade towards fast-growing economies in the Far East, for instance, and taking our trade away from the very slow-growing markets of the European Union. So in the long run, that might be a good idea. But there are clearly a fair bit of disruption in the short term, and some Conservatives, I think, say, well, look, it's not worth that disruption, and we can't have that. And others are saying, well, okay, we might have a few months of disruption, but in the long run, this will be fine. That would tend to be my view as well, by the way, as an economist.
Your view that it's better to have a clean break with the EU, no customs union?
Yes, I think so. So something, a normal free trade agreement. I mean, like the Canada Free Trade Agreement, and then perhaps the best customs arrangement that we can get. But customs are becoming more and more efficient all over the world. Technology is advancing fast. So Theresa May seems to have prioritised easy movement across the border. She's prioritised that against free trade agreements or ease of striking free trade agreements. But actually, the sort of flexibility of crossing borders, getting your lorries through with hardly any delay and issues of that sort. They're issues which are disappearing across the world anyway. So again, that's a sort of short term against a long term.
Disappearing,
conflict.
you say. I'm going to turn to Catherine Nicholson on this because we've heard the regional presidents here in France, in Normandy, in the north of France, who are worried sick of a no deal scenario. They say it's going to mean huge losses in terms of money, huge traffic jams for customs officials at borders. And it's going to be disaster for trade.
That's the no deal scenario. To jump in. It's a good one. That's the no deal scenario that we've been talking about, and I think it's good to underline that I've seen no prediction from any economists that there could be no economic damage either to the EU 27 or to the UK in the case of a no deal scenario. The consensus absolutely seems to be that a no deal scenario absolutely will damage the EU, but it will also damage the UK worse.
Yes, I mean there were meetings in the region of the Channel Ports, for example. The Hauliers Association recently said a 2-minute delay, just 2-minute delay on lorries coming over the Channel would cause 26, 27 kilometre tailbacks on roads around. It's in no one's interest to have that kind. It's not in Europe's interest. It's not in Britain's interest to have that kind of chaos. But that is, and I think that is the logical conclusion of a no deal, of just walking away. And I think people do underestimate that. And I think that this idea, they were talking, these same people, the actors who are involved in the Channel Ports area, were talking about hopefully they could have electronic tracking of vehicles. So a lorry with goods would get on a ferry at Dover, would come across, and in the time it took it to come across, there could be checks on customs. But that can't include everything. It doesn't include phytosanitary, veterinary, animal products. And the EU Commission itself has been quite clear in its document yesterday on what will happen if there is no deal.
And perhaps interesting, sorry, just to jump in, the timing of the EU issuing that particular bit of advice and research on the day when it did look like this new deal plan seemed to be coming together. This is just my own analysis, but perhaps kind of re-raising that spectre of how bad a no-deal scenario could be when there is something on the table.
And just to pick up on what Graham Gudgeon was saying earlier, this argument that's going on about whether Britain's future trading ties lie with Europe or elsewhere.
Well, I'm not an economist, and I would, but I have not. It is possible that in the long term there may be. We just don't know. That's the whole point. I'm not an economist. I can't say what is going to happen in the short term. I think no deal would be. I think all the evidence we've seen, all the people that we've spoken to, everybody is aware of what happens if there's no deal.
Of course, Graham Gudgeon, you're not arguing for no deal. You're arguing for a standard free trade agreement like the one the European Union currently enjoys with Canada.
Absolutely, and that's in everyone's interest. Interestingly, it's more in the interest of the Republic of Ireland than any other country, even more than the UK. And yet the Republic of Ireland has been part of this impressive discipline on the EU side of never mentioning anything that the Commission doesn't want mentioned, and that includes a free trade agreement. So that's been rather off the agenda from the EU side, but clearly it's in the interest of Europe, it's in the interest of the UK, it's in the interest of the Republic of Ireland.
I would just want to remind that at this point we're not negotiating the future.
Will prevail in the end, and
We're not
we will get
negotiating
there.
the future trading relationship at this point, though, Mr. Gudgeon. It is about the withdrawal agreement.
No, we are actually. There is going to be a document.
That's going to be the guidelines for the future trading relationship negotiations. It's a basis
but
point.
We expect the EU to be honourable and that the future negotiations will reflect those guidelines. I mean, they're not just there for cosmetics.
All right, let's explain this to viewers. The biggest sticking point remains Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, because for instance, we had earlier in the day Scotland's First Minister complaining that her constituents, who in majority voted Remain, would have to leave the single market, while the Northern Irish get to stay in under what we've heard, I guess because we haven't read the report, but what we've heard. Aaron Gooch has more on what's reportedly on the draft deal, and in particular, the safeguarding of the Good Friday agreements of 2 decades ago, which are brokered in part by the EU and which guarantee an open border to end the troubles that existed in Northern Ireland.
No, that's quite wrong.
It was a conflict that only ended in the 1990s. Violence between Irish Republicans and Unionists seeking to remain part of the United Kingdom left more than 3,500 people dead. But in April 1998 came the Good Friday Agreement. It put an end to 3 decades of bloodshed and eventually opened up the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Now, just 20 years later, tense Brexit negotiations have many worried that peace is at risk.
Will a hard border of some kind reappear, and will that then become the target for military activity, and will that see a resurgence of violence? We just don't know.
The United Kingdom's and therefore Northern Irish membership in the EU single market meant there were no customs inspections or border checks on the island of Ireland. More than 30% of Northern Ireland's exports go to the Republic, and an estimated 30,000 people cross the border for work daily. But after Brexit, this now invisible border with Northern Ireland will become an external EU frontier. To assuage fears of instability, the European Union and the UK agreed to prepare an insurance policy or backstop agreement, which could keep the border open. That is, until a definitive UK-EU trading relationship is agreed upon. Brussels had proposed that Northern Ireland maintain some elements of the EU's single market and customs union. But Theresa May and Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, which supports her government, say this is unacceptable. Though the draft deal attempts to find middle ground, the DUP's position is firm. They will refuse to support any agreement that would further separate Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK.
Yeah, and that prompting as early as Tuesday evening this reaction from former Foreign Minister Boris Johnson, a potential rival to Theresa May if there ever is a leadership battle. He claims the deal makes London beholden to Dublin.
If the reports are correct, there would have to be customs and regulatory checks down the Irish Sea as well. So effectively, you'd be in a position where the government in Dublin, for the first time since forever, would have more say over some matters in the government of Northern Ireland than London, because after all, Dublin is round the table in Brussels in a way that we won't be.
And at this point, let's say hello to Charles Tannock, member of the European Parliament who, from the Conservative Party, who joins us from Strasbourg, where they're in session. Thank you for joining us in the France 24 debate.
Good evening.
What's your reaction listening to Boris Johnson?
Well, Boris is Boris, and of course he's now trying to position himself again, re-enter the fray, as it were, on the hard Eurosceptic side of the debate. I mean, clearly his brother Joe, who was a pro-European, has left the government on the basis that he can't live with the proposed draft withdrawal agreement on the basis that it turns Britain into a vassal state, which is a word that also Boris, bizarrely, has been using from the other diametrically opposed view as a Eurosceptic. From the point of view of Joe Johnson, it's about the fact that there's a democratic deficit, that basically Britain will be enjoying some of the benefits economically. It won't frighten the horses with the car industry, for instance, that we will stay in the customs union for a long time unless some other technical solution can be found to the Northern Irish border. And it may be almost indefinite. There certainly is no time limit on that. An all-weather customs union will be part of the internal market for goods but not services. It's very much like the Chequers plan. It's actually, I call it the Jersey plan, because it's very like what happens in the island of Jersey off the French coast in the Channel Islands. And of course, Boris takes the view that this is totally unacceptable and that, you know, there won't be the independent global free trading Britain with its own trade policy making its way in the world, totally divorced from the continent and its biggest trading partners, namely the EU27. So it's very bizarre that this deal, if it's as we believe it will be, and obviously it hasn't been published yet, and the cabinet are still discussing it as we speak, and there's clearly no consensus at the cabinet level. This deal clearly has managed to excite and upset both the pro-Europeans and the Eurosceptics. So my next question is, does Mrs May have the numbers in the House of Commons to get it through, given the fact that there will be opposition from both sides of the debate? And on my side of the debate, which is obviously very pro-European, we're hoping for a people's vote, a second referendum. This should be put back to the people, because it's not what was described in 2016 or promised. And there'll be an awful lot of money being paid out, 39 billion euros, as part of the agreement, but no guarantee that the long-term trading relationship will give us the benefits which were described of being frictionless, as it were, by the Brexiteers. So it's a very interesting time. We obviously need to see the whole document, 500 pages long. I gather that there will be a statement made to the House of Commons tomorrow, a very brief statement by the Prime Minister tonight. But this problem is going to go on. And the saddest things about all of this is the fact that even if Brexit happens on the 29th of March next year, which is still probable, we haven't resolved anything. We haven't resolved the long-term relationship. There'll be the 2-year transition period in which my party will remain divided, the nation will remain divided. That's why I believe ownership of Brexit, given how complicated it's been proven to be, which I always said it would be, it would never be quick, it would never be easy. The EU, the United Kingdom certainly doesn't hold all the cards, as was promised. That basically ownership of this should be put back to the people in a referendum, in my view.
Do you agree, Grant Goodgen, that there should be a referendum?
No, this is a terrible idea.
Well,
it's really rather...
Let me put it to Graham Goodgen.
May I carry on?
Yes.
It's astonishing to me that so many apparently intelligent people put this forward. One of the key factors in the growth of Euroscepticism in the UK has been the EU's practice of telling people to rerun referenda when they didn't get the result they liked. To extend that practice back into the UK would be very corrosive of democracy. 2 points here. The UK is one of the very few European countries that hasn't got a big problem of populism, and that's due to Brexit. It's also got the most flourishing social democratic party anywhere in Europe, and again, that's due to Brexit. If people want to really undo all of that, then on their heads be it.
Charles Tannock?
I totally disagree with that, of course, because it's not the EU telling Britain to have another referendum. On the contrary, all the statements coming out from the Council of Ministers, the summits, is that in fact Brexit is going to happen. The deal has been struck, and there's no appetite for any further referendums or changes of course, or even amendments to the deal, which may still happen if the cabinet insists on some minor changes before the presumably the summit either next month or in January to agree to the whole thing. So I don't think the EU is telling us anything. It's the British electorate which has changed its mind in the last 2.5 years. Not only are there more young people who can vote now, a lot of the older Leave voters have actually died. So we are now, we're now doing a policy based on something decided 2.5 years ago on a very small majority, on a whole lot of false promises and lies told to the British electorate. and clearly things have moved on. And so and what we're seeing now is not what was on the can, on the tin described 2.5 years ago. So I believe that, a referendum might give some closure if we can get a sufficient majority one way or another. That would be a problem if it's still a very narrow victory. But I do believe in the idea of informed consent. I believe that the average member of the public actually understands what the European Union does for Britain and its citizens, whereas before there were just false promises made about a global Britain, loads of trade deals waiting for us, no problems in the WTO, no problems in Ireland, no problems in Gibraltar, and nobody mentioned the fact that freedom of the movement was also the right for Brits to go to Europe to live and work and study. And now we're told we may even have to have some kind of ESTA visa to visit the continent. It's, all these lies and false promises have been exposed. So let's put it back to the electorate. The only people who are opposed to the referendum, in my view, are those who are afraid of losing it. That's the reality. And of course, the big issue will be, if there is a referendum, is to have Remain on the ballot paper, because I suspect that Mrs May or Mr Corbyn may, if there is no deal voted in the House of Commons, agree to a referendum. But sadly, it may just be the deal as agreed versus no deal. And of course, that's hardly a fair contest, because there's no option to Remain. So I will be fighting, if we can get the people's vote through the House of Commons, for a Remain option. That's my personal view. And there are other pro-Europeans like me.
Let me ask Kim Wilshire, because I've heard people of two minds, even among Remainers, right? Some saying, let's have another referendum, and others who are, a little distraught, beaten down by the fact that it's torn apart Britain and polarized its politics, and they don't want to go through the ordeal a second time.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, from what obviously I don't live in the UK, but everything I hear from there, everything I read from there, is that Brexit has really bitterly divided the country, bitterly divided it. Now, however much the Leave campaign misled people, however, how many questions are raised about how it was funded, how it happened. It was not an overwhelming majority, as some Brexiters claim, but I do think a second vote does. My personal opinion is that a second vote may run the risk of even more division in the country, and also opens things up to accusations that it's not democratic. I think, as far as Europe is concerned, this is absolutely correct. Europe probably, from what I'm hearing, can't wait to get the process over and done with. It's been such a long waste of time for them, and energy and money, that they would quite like for it to be over. So whether a second vote, and in any case, there's no time to organise a second vote before March next year. We're 4 months away.
I'd say yes and no, just come in being a bit of a wonk on the data on all of this. You're quite right. There isn't time. In a sense, there's
almost
an
extension.
There's almost not time to even get a deal through on the current timetable, because let's not forget that the original idea was to have a deal, a withdrawal agreement, by the summit last October, the middle of last month. So yes, we're already running over time. There has been talk of moving beyond that March 29th deadline. But I've possibly spoken to different people from Kim, but for example, the Europe Minister of France, Nathalie Loiseau, others had said, it was the UK's decision to leave, and if the UK decided that actually we don't want to leave, well, the UK is, until March 29th, an EU member state. So just speaking on a purely technical, legal level, if the UK government revokes Article 50 as an EU member state, it can do so. I'm just saying that's the technical point of view. I think
the people's vote. The people's vote. I'm not saying that I personally oppose it. I think I'm just worried that if there was another. We hear people saying, "Oh, we'll have a people's vote. We'll have another vote." How many votes do we have until we get the right result?
But also, what would be on the ballot paper,
yes,
as Mr.
exactly.
Stanek was saying, and who would be putting that forward? Because I don't think there's a great. For example, the biggest opposition, the Labour Party. There's no unity from the Labour Party, for example.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that, because we saw it during Prime Minister's question time earlier. Theresa May responding in kind when Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn points out divisions with her own Brexit minister.
The But he wants to talk about different positions that are being taken. What we're doing is delivering a good deal that would deliver on the vote of the British people. We're delivering Brexit. What have we seen recently from the Labour Party? Well, the Labour leader said we can't stop Brexit. The shadow Brexit secretary said we can stop it. So when he stands up, he should make it clear. Is it Labour Party policy to stop Brexit?
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, Labour respects the result of the referendum. But what we don't respect is the shambolic mess that this government has made of negotiations.
Strong words, but he doesn't really answer Theresa May's barb there, does he?
No.
Let me ask you on this. Graham Gooch, at this point in time, what can be done to reconcile Britain?
Very difficult. I think this is one of the great economic and social changes of our age. You know, what one would go back to the Corn Laws, you know, the end of protection in the 19th century, which again was a hugely divisive issue in the country. These issues are divisive, and they may take decades to really settle down. But there's something very odd here. I don't remember anybody before the referendum, right up until the result on the night, being at all enthusiastic about the EU. The arguments tended to be, well, it's not great for Britain, but on the other hand, it would be very difficult to get out of, so we may as well stay in. And then the day after, suddenly there was this outpouring of enthusiasm about the EU that we hadn't seen before. And it's rather difficult for many of us to understand what actually lies behind that. What do these people actually want, and what are they arguing? Of course, they argue there will be short-term disruption, and we agree on that. But they say very little about the long term.
Kim Wilshire, you're applying currently for French citizenship. Right?
Yes.
As are many British expatriates. Can I say it? Catherine. Catherine is now... Catherine, you're one of my proud compatriots
Exactly,
now.
I've been accepted. Well, I've lived here for 10 years, so it makes sense.
Your thoughts on the effect this has had on you personally?
Personally, well, I feel rather personally quite angry about it. I'm quite worried. I've been here for quite a long time in France. I feel, I'm British. I was born in Britain, but I've always felt European. I just feel that it's... there are so many questions. There's so many people's lives. You speak to people. You speak to British people like myself who are here in France. Sometimes they have French husbands, or they're in Europe. They have European partners, or they're single. They don't know. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. Nobody thinks we're all going to be thrown out on the 29th of March. But there's so much uncertainty and so many people's lives tied up in what is going to happen in 4 months' time, or if there is the transition period later. But it's been very destabilising in terms of everything, really.
Charles Tannock, is it a fair point that Graham Gooch makes, that there was this campaign for Remain led by the then Prime Minister David Cameron, which essentially did argue that, well, Europe's not great, but we're better in than out?
Well, listen, it was a very poorly led and run campaign, in my view. Let's not revisit that one. I wanted to make 2 points. First of all, there is huge appetite now for a second referendum. All the opinion polls nationally show that many people want to recast their vote. Whether they've changed their minds or not, they want to be given the right to give informed consent to the final deal. So there is a desire. Secondly, I can't understand how a second referendum could be undemocratic. I believe that 2 referendums are twice as democratic as 1 referendum, particularly one as flawed as the one we had in 2016, where there were so many false promises made, lies told, possible foreign interference and funding, etc., an overspending by the Leave campaign. They were fined for overspending. All these things in any other jurisdiction, if it weren't for the fact that it's deemed to be an advisory referendum, would have been the courts challenging the result and perhaps demanding another rerun, given those facts that I've just mentioned. So I actually think the country is very divided. The political classes are very divided. We are now going to have I'm actually quite pleased about if we do Brexit on the deal of Mrs. May. It is one that's the least worst option, the least damaging to the economy. It's in some ways Brexit in name only on the economic front. But I sincerely believe that all these divisions are going to go on indefinitely now with the transition period. There's going to be a huge debate as to how do we get out of the customs union, how do the right-wing sort of Brexiteers find a way of tearing up whatever agreements have been made now in terms of the withdrawal agreement, scrapping it to have this kind of dream of a Empire Mark II, Anglosphere, free trading, global Britain, relinking up with the English-speaking world. All these are deluded, and they've been shown to be deluded in the last 2 years, but they still believe it, I'm afraid. The ERG genuinely believe that we can replace our markets in France and Germany with Australia and New Zealand, the other side of the world. So I don't believe the divisions are going to go away just because we don't have a second referendum at all. And this is going to take a very long time to settle one way or another. But if we had a second referendum with a clear majority, there's a bigger chance of doing so. And I just reminded Mr. Farage today, he was the one who said that a 52% Remain vote in 2016 wouldn't have settled it, and they would have campaigned for another referendum. So it's not just the pro-Europeans who are unhappy with things. The Brexiteers would not have just rolled over, given up their idea of leaving the European Union. But as it is now, we're not going to be leaving it at all in any significant way other than legally for 2 years during the transition period. And beyond that, we don't even know what the long-term trading relationship will be, and the fact that 39 billion euros will have to be spent in order to get to that stage. So it is a complete shambles. I've never known anything like it in my 22 years in elected office. I've been here 19 years in this parliament. I always predicted there would be huge problems with Ireland, with Gibraltar, with the WTO. There was never any evidence that the United Kingdom held all the cards. And I think obviously the treatment of EU citizens, I mean, I'm lucky. I'm going back to this conversation you were just having. I have an Irish passport now. My children are dual nationals. We're going to go into a world in Britain now where if you have a second EU passport, you will be somehow advantaged in terms of the job market, in terms of freedom of movement. It's kind of ridiculous, really. But the way that EU citizens were treated in the first few months, the bargaining chip story from Liam Fox, go whistle for your money from Boris Johnson, this set a very hostile tone. I'm glad that Mrs. May has now pulled back from that. She wants to stay close. But of course, she's managed to upset both sides of the debate, sadly. Both the pro-Europeans and the Eurosceptics in my party aren't very happy with this deal. So whether she has the numbers to get it through the House of Commons remains to be seen. But I give it a guarded welcome. It's better than Chequers, but it's certainly not as good as Remain. And I believe we have a right to make an informed consent on the final say in another referendum. But I agree that time is an issue. We don't have much time. It may take 22 weeks. And we may have to have an Article 50 extension. Then you have the problem of the European elections. So there are lots of obstacles. I don't underestimate how complicated my idea of a people's vote would be. But it is doable if there is the political will.
Graham Gudgeon, throughout these past 2 years...
There isn't the political will, that's the whole point. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, throughout these past 2 years, the Prime Minister of Britain has said, we're leaving the European Union, we're not leaving Europe. Do you feel like you're still a European?
Yes, indeed. Of course, I'm a European for geographical reasons, and I like Europe. I mean, I love France. I run a pro-Brexit academic website from Cambridge University, and my co-editor is a professor of French history, married to a French citizen, speaks French at home, loves France, studied at the Sorbonne, knows Paris much better than he knows London. He just doesn't think that the right place for the UK is within the European Union. He loves Europe. I love most aspects of Europe as well. That's really not the issue. The issue is one of governance. Do we want to be governed by a really rather weakly democratic country that's obviously, in the long run, wants to set up a United States of Europe? The question is, do you want to be a province of a United States of Europe, or do you want to be an independent sovereign nation? Like most of my compatriots and most people who hold a British passport, which most people on this programme don't seem to prefer. We want to be an independent sovereign country, as so many other countries in the world do. Nothing strange about that.
Completely that's a myth.
Catherine Nicholson, we are in the prelude to the European election campaigns, parliamentary elections campaigns, which are coming up in the spring, as Charles Tannock was mentioning. Is Brexit going to be high on the minds?
Oh, absolutely. There are quite a few very sort of important or significant voices within Europe that are talking about this European election as being a moment when the EU is going to relaunch itself. A year ago, we had Emmanuel Macron giving that big speech at the Sorbonne University in Paris that you might remember. He was putting forward his ideas for the future of Europe. He's continued to do that. He's launched citizens' consultations to sort of try and put about this idea that the citizens are being made more involved in Europe.
Have they moved on to the other issues? The other issues being, of course, the rise of populism elsewhere.
Populism is probably the biggest issue for this
whether
election,
or not you have a more federal Europe when it comes to money.
Well, you can see already, I mean, Angela Merkel was speaking at the European Parliament in Strasbourg yesterday. I'm sure Mr. Tannock was in the plenary with me listening to her. She was speaking about a European army, for example. We know that Emmanuel Macron was speaking about that recently because he so annoyed Donald Trump with his comments. The European army idea, or more coordinated European military forces, has been floating around in Europe for quite some time, but actually it was the UK that had really been holding off on that and saying, you know, we really don't think this is a great idea. It looks like now that the UK is going out of the door, the rest of these very big, powerful European countries, France and Germany, you know, France is a huge military power, isn't it? They look like they're trying to bulldoze on with this, and there's a lot of support in the EU.
Right. Is that just talk, or are they going to keep on with their strong bilateral ties with the UK? Is, of course, a subject for another debate, which unfortunately we're out of time for now. But I want to thank you, Catherine Nicholson. I want to thank Kim Wilshire, Graham Gudgeon for being with us from London, Charles Tannock in Strasbourg. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.